great. Amazing to be here. I've learnt a lot already. Let's take it out into the landscape. So I don't know if, how many of you are aware of what we've been doing at Knepp Estate. It's only 14 miles up the A24 from here. But it's a rewilding project. We're 3,500 acres. We used to be an intensive arable and dairy farm, and it took us 17 years of trying to make that business work. It was already losing money hand over fist when my husband and I inherited it in the 1980s. We're on very, very heavy Sussex clay, and I'm sure a lot of you will be aware of what that's like, particularly at the moment. It couldn't work as an intensive modern farm. So eventually we decided to do something with the land rather than battling against it all the time. And we did a rewilding project. So this is our land under the old regime, and this is what's happened to it as we've begun to rewild, as the land has sort of begun to heal itself. A lot of what you see there is popping up is this amazing thorny scrub. It's a habitat that we have absolutely zero tolerance for in our landscapes today, but it is one of the most biodiverse habitats there is. So this is what it looks like now. It's become a functioning ecosystem again. We have water sitting where it always wanted to sit. That's an incredible draw for wildlife. It's also holding back water in times of flood, so we know that our land is acting now like a sponge and actually protecting areas downstream. Our soils have restored, so we've introduced free-roaming animals, as part of this mix, interrupted my own video. Let me do that. Okay. Anyway, so you get the idea of what this now looks like. It now looks like something more like the Okavango Delta in Africa than it would like normal British landscape. So we've restored our soils. We are now sequestering double the amount of carbon in our soils. Our microbiota in the soils have come back, tripled our mycorrhizal fungi, that wonderful underground network of roots that actually holds onto soils and gives it its texture and provides nutrients to the plants. And when you walk out now on a spring morning into that scrubland, the volume of birdsong is so loud that it literally reverberates in your stomach. It's changing the baseline for what ecologists now feel habitats like this could actually provide. But it's not just the mass, the volume of life that's come back, it's the rarity that's been astonishing as well. So we're seeing birds in our landscape that, for example, the raven, that we haven't seen at Knepp for 100 years. We've got peregrine falcons nesting in a tree. That's almost unheard of for this cliff nesting bird. We're one of the biggest breeding hotspots for nightingales. Again, incredibly critically endangered bird. I think we're second only to the Lodge Hill site in Kent, which is old MOD land, which has just been zoned for housing. So unfortunately, we may soon be the top spot. We're also fantastic for cuckoos. I know, talking to friends who now don't hear cuckoos in their countryside anymore. You're guaranteed to hear cuckoos at Knepp. They've all come back because the habitat has just sort of exploded. And this is perhaps our kind of headline species, because this is an extraordinary, nobody could ever have predicted this. This is a turtle dove. It's the most likely bird, according to the RSPB, to go extinct from our shores in the next 10 to 15 years. Its numbers have fallen off a cliff. When I was growing up in the 1960s, we had 125,000 pairs of turtle doves. It was a sound of summer, just like the cuckoo, and we were about to lose it. But only a few years into our project, we began to hear turtle doves. We are now the only place, probably, in the UK where turtle dove numbers are actually rising. So astonishing things are happening, and we have to keep reminding ourselves that this is within 20 years, and the depleted landscape that we were before, the chemically abused farm landscape that we were underneath the Gatwick stacking system, surrounded by A roads, and this is happening here on our land. We've also now got all 5 UK species of owls. So we've got the predators back up there in the skies again, which is really exciting. So I think what has astonished us too is that with this project is that originally it began as a sort of nature project, an idea that we could try and regenerate biodiversity on our very impoverished soils again. But I think what we found at Knepp is that what we're doing is actually addressing so much more than that. It addresses many of the crises, environmental crises that are currently facing us, like soil degradation. We know that we've got scientists now talking about 100 harvests left across the globe before we lose our topsoils altogether. That's how badly we've treated them under chemical farming. So we've got to think of ways that we can get our soils back. We've also got to think of ways of mitigating against floods. And now we look at Knepp and how effective it's being at controlling floods in times of rains like we've just been having. And I'm thinking of the, to my mind, totally absurd development down between Shoreham and Lancing, the new Monks farm project with IKEA, and on the floodplain. How is that allowed to happen? But then you can see that upstream, if you can actually hold on to your floods, what a service we are doing for them. So wider developments like Monk's Farm pay for the farmers upstream to rewild the catchment of the River Ada to actually secure their own future and protect them from floods.
Is it working?
It is, yeah. But the other thing that I think has been really interesting for us is that from going from being an intensive farm, where we're essentially just releasing carbon into the atmosphere all the time, the plough was probably the worst invention man ever came up with. It is the way that we lose our soils, but we also release carbon from our soils and from our vegetation. So going from our system, our intensive farm system, to what we do now, we are now actually a positive carbon sink. So incredibly interesting to look at how Knepp, even on a small scale, is already answering many of the problems that are facing us. But obviously we can't rewild the whole of Great Britain. We will always need space for agriculture, we'll need space for buildings and cities, we need places to live. So how then does rewilding fit into our big landscape? Well, this is what we sort of generally we think of, I think, as our British countryside, and most people look at that and actually consider it quite beautiful, normal, and that is our green and pleasant land, our very organised, very controlled landscape. But we know it's not functioning. What we don't appreciate a lot when we look at a landscape like that is it is almost a clinical desert from the point of view of biodiversity, but it's also not functioning in terms of carbon. It's a huge carbon release, and it's also not functioning in terms of hydrology and flooding. So what we've done here is we've used a wonderful Dutch artist who works for Rewilding Europe. He does a lot of illustrations for them to pictorialise this scene and to show how we might envisage this classic British landscape changing over the next few years. Well, if you can imagine that here are our biodiversity hotspots, so our Knepps, for example. So probably areas of about 1,000 acres or more, where you've rewilded, you've got your ecosystems functioning again, you've got extraordinary species longing to just burst out into the countryside. If they burst out into that countryside, they're not going to have any chance of survival, no habitat at all for them. So what can we do? Well, we can build wildlife corridors. We have to join up our nature reserves, that most of them are very isolated, surrounded by monocultures of crops. If they stay isolated like that, the populations within them that we're trying to protect will not be resilient into the future, and that includes being resilient against climate change. They have to be able to move, and they have to be able to interact with other populations. So wildlife corridors are hugely important. But of course you've still got roads across them. We've got to get rid of that. This is the internal border of the Iron Curtain in Germany. It's turned some of it into a wonderful wildlife reserve, but there are still roads crossing it. And of course that's a big barrier for small mammals and even insects. And a lot of creatures will just get hammered by those roads. So we can create road bridges, land bridges, green bridges, eco-ducts, whatever you want to call them. In Europe, they're fantastically good at this. I think Holland has 30 of these land bridges. It's got plans for 20 more. We are absolutely useless at this in the UK. We've got 2. And they're pretty ineffectual. And every year, this is the tragedy, every year, the past few years, we've been returning millions of euros to Europe that were intended for projects like this because we just hadn't thought about how to spend the money. And of course, our hedges can be fantastic wildlife corridors in themselves. We know at Knepp, this is a hedgerow at Knepp, that if you allow your hedges to billow out, if you get them to about twice or a third more the width, you suddenly attract more species. These stars are where we have nightingales. If you're in a nightingale area, it's going to be a very easy fix to get greater wildlife nightingale habitat by just expanding your hedgerows and restoring your hedgerows, getting them really species rich. And of course, with nightingales, that's just an umbrella, a charismatic species that we kind of fixate on. But underneath that nightingale is a whole range of other species that will also benefit. So we've got to improve our hedgerows in our existing hedgerows in our system, and we are lucky enough to have hedgerows still in Sussex. But also we can talk about expanding nature out of the hedgerows into nature bands, ribbons around our conventional farming. Because we know that even with conventional chemical farming, if you have sacrificed a strip of land around your fields, your yields go up. So it's a no-brainer. These margins, this is what it looks like, these margins are producing, pollinating insects, but they're also producing the predators that actually can help control your pests inside that field. But we can't go on farming as we are. We cannot go on ploughing. We cannot continue doing monocultures. We have to move to regenerative farming. I'm not even talking about sustainable farming. We have to go to a system where you're actually going to start growing your topsoils again. And the people at the forefront of this revolution actually happen to be in areas which are hurting even more than us. I mean, there are some areas in Britain that are hurting already. I think areas of the fens where there may only be 15 harvests left because the topsoil has just disappeared so fast. But places like Australia, obviously a terrific brittle zone, very, very little topsoil. Places in Africa and America. This is where farmers are working out for themselves, pardon the pun, at grassroots, that this is a way that actually works. If I was going to take one of these, they're all fantastic references, but if I was going to take one of them, I'd urge you to read Dirt to Soil by Gabe Brown. He's a North Dakota farmer. He's got some presentations on YouTube, but he almost went bust in North Dakota, very harsh climate, very back against the wall in terms of agriculture. He almost went bust. I think he had two summers of drought and followed by hailstorms that destroyed his crops. He's now farming without any inputs whatsoever. He is now in the top 25% of food producers in North Dakota. So this myth that regenerative farming cannot produce the same amount of food as chemical farming is absolute nonsense. What he has shown is that he can actually extend his growing season because his soils are so restored. His soils in the winter are 6 degrees warmer than his neighbours because he's got all that function back. It's a living soil, which means he's got a longer season to grow stuff. He doesn't even have to irrigate in the summer like his neighbours do because his plants and his soils are holding on to moisture. So he's not only doing the right thing for the environment and improving his soils and sequestering carbon, he's also making a profit. For the first time in his life, he is making considerable profits. And what he is doing is he is passing on those profits to the consumer. So at his gate, in his farm gate, he's selling his vegetables, obviously much more nutritious because they're pulling up nutrients from improved soils, for a much cheaper price than you would get in a supermarket. It's a win-win-win situation. The problem is that it's not happening everywhere. So once you have this happening on a much wider scale, then the economies of scale come into play. You can get actual deliveries, can happen, and it will eclipse conventional farming. So it's a question of how do we get that tipping balance that you can finally dismantle the huge food and farming industry interest, which obviously has great vested interest in maintaining the status quo. So here we are with some regenerative agriculture back in our fields. We can also look at wood pasture, again another way of producing meat and also timber, perhaps fruit crops as well. That two-tier system, a bit like the dehesas in Spain or Portugal, where you've got pigs foraging underneath the oak groves. But, sorry, we can zoom in. Those animals down there, perhaps you can look at Alan's savoury system of mob grazing, where you can move the animals on from the ground, so you can actually move them around an area so that the soils actually have time to recover behind them. Hugely powerful, not time to go into it here, but this is a hugely powerful way of recovering land, recovering the soils. In fact, it's being used to reverse desertification all across the planet. And this is what a wood pasture looks like at Knepp, but again, of course, you can have different animals in it, you can have fruit trees, you could do all sorts of different things. And then we've got to look at our water systems. So this river, actually, to me, looks very much like the current River Ada. We actually got blow-up canoes at one point and paddled with our small children underneath the A24 from Knepp, almost the whole way to Shoreham. And I think we saw 2 swans and a few seagulls the whole way down. It's absolutely dead as a habitat. It also doesn't function as for holding floodwater back. We know that now. The old Victorian idea of getting the water as fast off the land as possible does not work. We are seeing extreme weather events that we just cannot cope with. We've got to take the Dutch and German model and actually hold our water onto our land for longer. That's the only way we're going to make our towns and cities and our farmland safe and protect it from flooding. So let's rewild the river. Let's get a much more functioning ecosystem. Let's get our floodplains working again. And here we can play with this a little bit and zoom in a little bit. I don't know if you can quite see it there, but Jerome, the lovely Dutch illustrator, has taken some European liberties, which I hope will happen one day. We've got an elk in there, which is an American moose. Why not? They were here once. We should have them back again. That sort of creature having a little sand bath is a bison. Why not? They're proving a keystone species in rewilding projects in Europe. And of course, if you can see, sitting on his little pile of sticks there is a beaver. Beavers can get this sort of habitat restored at no cost, simply. We restored a little piece of the River Ada that goes across our land. I think it took about 6 or 7 years of feasibility studies with the Environment Agency. And then when Reg, the digger driver, did his work, he simply couldn't let go, couldn't understand how to get messy. And so he just did another canal, but just wiggling. So we've spent years since then trying to mess up Reg's Canal and make it function again and allow the animals to puddle the perimeter of it, putting woody debris blockages in to make it much more dynamic. In effect, we spent 2 years trying to be beavers. We now have, at Knepp, thankfully, got our government has granted our licence to release beavers at Knepp, so we will have 2 pairs of beavers, hopefully, if not this spring, if we can't get onto the land to get the revetments in time, it may be this autumn, but we will have 2 pairs of beavers doing this sort of thing, which hopefully will be, again, containing much more water on our land, not only making a fantastic new habitat for biodiversity, but also protecting downstream. So again, I'm hoping that we can invite some of that new Monks Farm and IKEA up to come and have a look at what we're doing for them. So we can still have our food production. We can think of we've got our wildflower hay meadows and our water meadows all still functioning. You've got sheep and cattle still grazing out there. They're just on much more functioning land. And then we can have areas for greenhouse food production, so horticulture essentially, precision fermentation, precision biology, fly farming, all these new technologies coming on stream that we're going to be getting new sources of protein from, and of course energy coming from town waste feeding biodigesters. This could all be closer into our towns, and again, not a bad thing to be living amongst compared to how horrific our green belts are at the moment. And so this is really a whole rewilded landscape, but once we've got these areas coming back, we can still continue to improve them. And one of the ways we can improve them, and I could say a lot about this because it does take me off on a bit of a tangent, but it's a bugbear of my mind at the moment, there is a plantation of trees. And in our enthusiasm to get out there and get trees into the landscape, which of course we have to do, we are going out there with spades and saplings from nurseries which may bring in diseases. We're putting them in polypropylene tubes and attaching them to tannalized wooden stakes with plastic ties. Hugely carbon costly to do it this way, and it's also very bad for the trees. We're wanting to have trees out there in the landscape that actually have immune systems that can survive the onslaught of diseases coming in from Europe as with increasing climate change. A monoculture of trees like that in the bottom left-hand corner is very, very vulnerable, and it's also very poor for biodiversity. So let's get cleverer about how we plant our trees. Even if we're going to be using them for timber, we can selectively harvest for timber, so you've got a rolling stock. They're used to doing this again in Europe, much better at it than we are, so no clear felling. But also planting through natural regeneration. Nature can do it for us much, much more cheaply, much more effectively. And then you've got different ages of trees again in that structure, different species, also adding to resilience. And let's have some dead trees, please, for some lovely wildlife. And then we can keep on connecting as our woodlands recover, as our water areas, our wetlands recover. We can carry on connecting and keep adding those wildlife corridors. So eventually rewilding becomes the webbing that goes throughout all our agricultural areas, right into our towns. It can feed into our towns with wildlife corridors so that you can start seeing hedgehogs and foxes perhaps again, or you've seen foxes already, but you can see hedgehogs, you can see white storks in your towns. You can have a much more interesting biodiversity inside, through our gardens and into our towns. So this is what we've come from, our depleted landscape, hopefully not looking quite so green and pleasant anymore. But this is what we could be, I think, if we start to free ourselves up a bit. And it is very much about ourselves. It's about changing our own mindset, letting go, learning how to be messy, getting rid of that sort of corseted Victorian obsession we have with tidying up. It's about enjoying the function coming back and unpredictability, welcoming in wild animals where we never expected to see them before. It really is about a change of mindset. And for the first time in my life, I think it might actually happen. We are now at a place where we are looking at government seriously interested in funding this change of heart. So obviously carbon is a big driver. And you can see now that from this system how much more carbon we're taking down. It's now acting as a carbon sink. And nature is the biggest tool we have in our efforts to combat climate change. We don't even have carbon figures yet for scrub or for grazing pasture, but we know that if you have functioning soils, functioning vegetation, it will be a carbon sink. So this is a huge reversal if we can get our landscapes to change this way. So how do we do it? Well, I think a lot of it is just us getting messier. We can do a lot of it in our own back gardens. We know that our gardens across Britain amount to about 1 million acres. That's more than acreage than we have in nature reserves altogether. So if we just do our own bit in our own backyard, that can be hugely significant. Instead of fighting wildlife, we can actually welcome it into our gardens. And of course, we have to go organic and stop using chemicals altogether. If everyone who has a vegetable allotment and everyone who wants one was allowed to have a vegetable allotment, according to Dave Goulson from Sussex University, we could be producing pretty much all our own fruit and veg in the UK. But I think really what the answer to get a fundamental change in the landscape is always going to come down to government, as the last speaker was saying. And so I think it's very interesting about this polluter pays principle, which Dieter Helm talks a lot about. If you haven't read his book, Green and Prosperous Land, Dieter Helm is extremely interesting on this. Levelling the polluter pays principle at the farmers for the first time ever, really. So why should we as a consumer be paying extra money on our water bills because a farmer upstream has been polluting with nitrates and soil, and we have to pay the cost of that? Pollution needs to be paid, the cost of pollution needs to be paid at source, and I think that's going to be a big game changer in getting farmers to think differently. But also when we're looking at all these huge developments around us, and we can look at carbon credits and bio credits. When someone is not just an industry or a company who can of course also offset their carbon, but we're looking at these huge developments in towns around us. Whenever a piece of land is taken out of productivity, out of that potential to be a carbon sink, that development needs to pay. And very interestingly, David Hill of the Environment Bank says that if we did this carbon offsetting for all developments in England alone, we could get £1.2 billion a year that could be paid to farmers and land managers to incentivise them to do the right thing on their land. And that's a huge figure if you think that we have been getting 1.7 billion euros from Europe just in farm subsidies. So it's a complete turnaround of how we think. So if we think this way and we can let go, if we can change our mindset, if we can become wilder in our own heads and connect with other people and talk in a way that can get us all joined up and thinking at network landscape scale, then I think we can have a landscape that not only is sustainable for the future, it's a huge carbon sink, and it's going to be a fantastically good, fun place to live in.